They were dropped from the sky into a frozen wasteland, miles behind enemy lines, with nothing but a parachute, a rifle, and the knowledge that they were surrounded. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. The enemy was everywhere. But the biggest battle these men faced wasn't against the North Korean army waiting in the dark. It was against the United States Army that had sent them there. The generals in the Pentagon had written a report stating that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, the initiative, and the courage to be special operations warriors. They said a black man could dig a ditch or drive a truck, but he could never be a ranger. They were wrong. This is the story of the only all-black Special Forces unit in American history. A group of men who took the most elite title the military had to offer and drenched it in their own blood and glory. Before we jump into the fire with them, I want to see who's holding the line with us today. We are building a community of people who respect real history here. So do me a favor. Go down to the comments right now and sound off with your city and state. Let's map out exactly where the real patriots are watching from today. Check in below, and let's get into it. Imagine the United States Army in 1950. 5 years had passed since the end of World War II, the war that was supposed to kill fascism and prove that freedom was the ultimate power. But inside the American military machine, the old rod of racism was still eating away at the foundation. President Truman had signed the order to desegregate the military 2 years prior, but a signature on a piece of paper in Washington does not change the hearts of men in the barracks. The Army was still profoundly, stubbornly divided. The officers were almost exclusively white. The elite units were white. The prevailing wisdom, taught in the war colleges and whispered in the officers' clubs, was based on a notorious study from 1925 that claimed African Americans were a subservient race, mentally inferior, and cowardly in the face of danger. This wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. It was the doctrine that decided who got a rifle and who got a shovel. But in June of 1950, that doctrine collided with a brutal reality. The North Korean People's Army, backed by Soviet tanks and Chinese strategy, smashed across the 38th parallel. They didn't just beat the South Korean forces, they annihilated them. The American advisors and the first troops sent in to stop the bleeding were pushed back, overrun, and humiliated. The U.S. Army, fat and happy from the victory of W2, was suddenly fighting for its life in a country of steep mountains and rice paddies that smelled of human waste and death. They were pushed all the way back to the Pusan perimeter, a tiny corner of the peninsula, with their backs against the sea. Desperation has a way of clarifying things. The Army realized it couldn't win this war with the tactics of 1945. They needed shock troops. They needed men who could move fast, strike hard, and vanish. They needed raiders. They needed rangers. The call went out to form new airborne ranger companies, elite, independent units that would answer directly to the Corps commanders. These weren't going to be standard infantry. These men would be expected to jump out of airplanes at night, sabotage supply lines, seize critical bridges, and kill the enemy in close quarters combat. And here's where the crack in the wall appeared. The Army needed bodies. They needed volunteers who were physically perfect and mentally unbreakable. And there were thousands of black soldiers, veterans of W-PAR and hungry young recruits who were tired of driving trucks. They were tired of being told they were second class. When the call for airborne rangers went out, they didn't just step forward, they surged. The Army leadership was faced with a dilemma. They could integrate these black volunteers into white ranger companies, which would violate the unwritten social codes of the time and allegedly destroy morale, or they could reject them and lose a massive pool of talent. They chose a third option, one that was cynical but unintentionally historic. They decided to create a single, segregated ranger company. They would gather all the black volunteers, put them in one unit, and see if they would sink or swim. It was the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, airborne. To the brass, this was likely seen as a containment strategy. Put the Negroes together so they don't infect the white elite units. If they fail, the 1925 study is proven right. If they succeed, well, the Army gets a few dead North Koreans out of the deal. But to the men who volunteered, this wasn't an experiment. It was a challenge. It was a gauntlet thrown down in the dirt. They knew exactly what the stakes were. They knew that if they were just good, they would be ignored. If they were average, they would be disbanded. To survive, they had to be the best damn unit the United States Army had ever produced. The selection process was brutal. It was designed to weed out the weak, the hesitant, and the unsure. Of the thousands of black soldiers who applied, only a few hundred were selected for training. They were sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, the heart of the Jim Crow South. Imagine the psychological pressure. These men were training to become the ultimate warriors for a country that wouldn't let them buy a sandwich in the town next to the base. They would spend their days learning how to kill with their bare hands, how to navigate through dense forests, how to jump from C-119 flying boxcars, and then they would spend their weekends navigating a society that viewed them as subhuman. The cadre, the instructors, were tough, but the men of the 2nd Rangers were tougher. They developed a culture of ferocious excellence. They called themselves the Buffalo Rangers, a nod to the Buffalo Soldiers of the frontier days, the black cavalrymen who had earned the respect of the Apaches and the Comanches. But these new buffaloes weren't riding horses. They were riding the wind. They were airborne. And the airborne tab on the shoulder was the ultimate status symbol. It meant you weren't just a leg soldier, you were a paratrooper. You were crazy enough to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Within the fences of Fort Benning, a unique brotherhood began to form. In a white unit, a soldier might fight for his country, or for his flag, or for the guy next to him. In the 2nd Ranger Company, they fought for something deeper. They fought for the vindication of their existence. Every push-up, every 5-mile run, every perfect landing was a middle finger to the establishment that doubted them. They were driven by a collective rage that they channeled into a cold, hard discipline. Their commander was Lieutenant Warren Bing Evans, a white officer. This was standard procedure. The Army still didn't trust black officers to command elite units entirely on their own, although the 2nd Rangers would eventually produce some of the finest black leaders in the military. Evans was a good officer, a fair man who cared about performance, not politics. But the soul of the unit resided in its NCOs, the sergeants and the corporals. Men who had seen combat in Italy and France during the Bataillon, men who knew the sound of a bullet snapping past their ear. They took the raw recruits, city kids from Detroit, farm boys from Alabama, and hammered them into a weapon. The training at Benning was not just physical, it was tactical. They learned the art of the ambush. They learned demolition. They learned how to operate at night, moving like shadows. Night operations were considered the most difficult form of infantry combat, requiring supreme trust and coordination. The generals believed black soldiers were terrified of the dark, prone to superstition and panic. The 2nd Rangers mastered the night. They learned to own the darkness, to use it as a cloak. They became creatures of the night, silent and lethal. By the fall of 1950, the 2nd Ranger Company was ready. They were physically sculpted, tactically sharp, and mentally hardened by the racism they faced every day. They had completed the arduous Ranger training cycle, suffering fewer washouts than many of the white companies. They looked impressive on the parade deck, their boots gleaming, their jump wings shining silver on their chests. But a parade deck is not a battlefield. The real test was waiting across the Pacific Ocean, in the freezing mountains of Korea. When the order to deploy came, there was no hesitation. They packed their gear, wrote their letters home, and boarded the trains. They were heading to a war that was going badly. The Chinese had entered the conflict, changing the dynamic overnight. The U.S. forces were reeling. The Army needed the Rangers, not next month, but yesterday. As they traveled toward the port of embarkation, moving through the segregated towns of the South, they were a strange sight. Heavily armed black men, wearing the berets and patches of the elite, moving with a swagger that unnerved the local sheriffs and shopkeepers. They were a glimpse of the future, a future where black power wasn't a slogan, but a reality, backed by firepower. They arrived in Korea in December 1950. It was the coldest winter in memory. The wind cut through their uniforms like razor blades. The ground was frozen solid, making it impossible to dig foxholes. This was the environment that had broken the German army in Russia, and now it was threatening to break the American army in Korea. The 2nd Rangers stepped off the ship into this freezer, their breath pluming in the air, their hands gripping the cold steel of their M1 Garands and carbines. They were assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, a unit that had been battered by the Chinese offensive. The white regular infantry looked at these newcomers with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They saw the Ranger tabs, but they also saw the black faces. The rumors had preceded them. The old lies about black troops running away, about them sleeping on guard duty. The 2nd Rangers knew they were walking into a hostile audience. They knew they had to prove themselves immediately. They couldn't afford a warm-up period. Their first missions were patrols, scouting out the enemy positions, probing the lines. It was dangerous work. The terrain was mountainous and unforgiving. One wrong step on an icy trail meant a fall into a ravine. One careless noise meant a mortar round landing on your head. But the Rangers moved with a ghost-like silence. They brought back intelligence. They engaged in small skirmishes, winning firefights against North Korean guerrillas. They were competent. They were professional. But competence wasn't enough. To shatter the stereotype, to truly make their mark, they needed a defining moment. They needed a mission that was considered impossible. And in the early months of 1951, as the UN forces prepared for a counteroffensive, that mission would arrive. It would involve airplanes, a drop zone behind enemy lines, and a village called Munsan-ni. It would be the first combat jump in the history of the Rangers, and the men of the 2nd Company were going to be the tip of the spear. The generals who doubted them were about to be given a lesson in warfare they would never forget. The mission was codenamed Operation Tomahawk. By March 1951, the stalemate of the Korean War had devolved into a gruesome, grinding cycle of taking and losing hills. General Matthew Ridgway, the brilliant and aggressive commander who had stabilized the shattered 8th Army, realized he needed to disrupt the enemy's logistics and shatter their morale. He planned a massive counteroffensive to push the Chinese and North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. The key to this offensive was a daring airborne operation. A paratrooper dropped deep behind enemy lines, near the village of Munsan-ni, designed to cut the enemy's main line of retreat and open a flanking avenue for the advancing ground troops. The Airborne Rangers were to be the spearhead of this operation. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team was the main force, but the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, was tasked with the most critical, most dangerous objective: landing first, securing the drop zone, and establishing a protective perimeter. They were to be the first boots on the ground in the largest American airborne operation since World War II. When the men of the 2nd Rangers received the briefing, the atmosphere in the room was electric. This was it. This wasn't a patrol. This was history. They were being entrusted with the most sensitive and high-risk mission of the war. They knew that the entire Army, from the officers who doubted them in the general staff to the white infantrymen who still eyed them with skepticism in the chow hall, would be watching their performance. Failure was unthinkable. Failure would not just cost them the battle, it would cost the reputation of every black soldier who would ever fight after them. The immediate preparations were a frantic rush of logistics and last rites. They checked their parachutes, their demolition charges, and their weapons. The cold was still their constant enemy. They had to tape their rifle mechanisms to keep the grease from freezing, risking jams in the extreme cold. They wore multiple layers of clothing, but they knew that once the wind hit them at 1,000 feet, the cold would be a physical punch that could knock the breath out of them. They wrote their final letters home, simple notes to mothers, wives, and fathers, knowing that a combat jump behind enemy lines carried a 50-50 chance of returning alive. The night before the jump, the companies assembled at the airfield. The air was full of the noise of C-119 flying boxcars, massive twin-boomed aircraft that looked like they were designed by children. The troops filed onto the planes, the 2nd Rangers at the front, ready to jump first. The atmosphere inside the cargo bay was thick with the smell of canvas, engine oil, and fear. White paratroopers from the 187th were packed shoulder to shoulder with the Black Rangers. For many of the white soldiers, this was the first time they had been that close to a large group of black men since they left the segregated South. The irony was palpable. In a few hours, their lives would depend on the courage of the very men they were taught to despise. The flight to the drop zone was long, cold, and terrifying. The planes were unheated. The men sat in stoic silence, looking at the black void outside the cargo door. The fear was a living thing, a cold knot in the stomach. The jumpmaster, the man in charge of the operation, checked the line, slapping the men on the shoulder, ensuring they were ready to clip their static lines to the anchor cable. The NCOs of the 2nd Company were calm, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had seen war before. They talked quietly, reminding the younger men to count to 3, to pull the ripcord, to check the canopy. They were the reassuring anchors in a plane full of men facing the abyss. As they neared the drop zone, the signal lights came on. Green light. This was the final moment. The door was rolled back. The cold wind howled into the cargo bay, a physical shock that stole the air from their lungs. The ground below was a dark, featureless blur, a massive canvas of nothingness dotted with tiny, distant fires, the signal flares marking the drop zone. The 2nd Ranger Company jumped first. They filed out of the roaring maw of the C-119, one after another, disappearing into the black Korean night. They fell through the icy air, the sound of the plane quickly fading above them, replaced by the terrifying silence of freefall. They pulled their ripcords, and the massive canopy snapped open, violently arresting their descent. For a few short minutes, they were alone, suspended between the stars and the enemy, silent hunters descending to the ground. The landing was brutal. The terrain was rough, the snow was deep, and the men were heavily laden with combat gear. They hit the ground hard, collapsing their parachutes, and immediately plunged into the highest state of alert. They had landed in the middle of a major Chinese and North Korean supply and communications hub. The enemy, though surprised, was not disorganized. The sound of distant machine guns and small arms fire immediately cut through the night. The party had started. The mission of the 2nd Rangers was clear. Secure the drop zone perimeter before the main paratrooper force landed. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency they had practiced back in the swamps of Fort Benning. They set up their machine guns, established their lines of fire, and began engaging the surprised enemy forces. The fighting was quick, brutal, and fought at close quarters. The North Koreans who stumbled onto the drop zone were not expecting to be met by a wall of perfectly aimed fire from an elite unit they didn't even know existed. The combat that ensued was decisive. The 2nd Ranger Company fought with a cold, focused fury. They cleared out pockets of resistance, silenced mortar teams, and established a rock-solid perimeter. When the main force of the 187th Airborne began to jump, thousands of paratroopers filling the sky, they landed into a zone already secured by the silent, professional violence of the Black Rangers. The main force suffered remarkably few casualties during the landing, a testament to the effectiveness of the 2nd Ranger Company. This was the company's defining moment. They had executed the most demanding mission in the American military playbook flawlessly. The experiment that the generals had set up for failure had just delivered the entire main force into safety. The commanders on the ground and the pilots in the air could not deny the evidence. The Black Rangers had been the tip of the spear, and they had not bent. They had not broken. They had been the best. The praise that came after the successful jump was grudging, but overwhelming. General Ridgway himself ordered the unit to remain in Korea, knowing he needed their unique skills. The official report stated that the 2nd Ranger Company performed with exceptional skill and courage, suffering minimal casualties while ensuring the success of the entire operation. The white paratroopers of the 187th, who had jumped into a safe zone, looked at the men of the 2nd Company with a profound and lasting respect. The stereotypes of the past, the lies about courage and competence, were physically blown away by the wind of their descent. Operation Tomahawk was a resounding success. It severely crippled the enemy's ability to supply their front lines and paved the way for the UN counteroffensive. But the fight for the 2nd Ranger Company was far from over. Their success meant that the Army would now use them mercilessly. They were now the designated shock troops, the ones called upon when a mission was too difficult, too dangerous, or too critical for anyone else. They had proven they could take a punch. Now, the Army was going to see just how many they could withstand. The Buffalo Rangers had earned their wings, and they were about to drench them in more blood. Their journey into the frozen hell of Korea had just begun. The success of Operation Tomahawk was both the making and the undoing of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company. They had delivered a textbook performance, proving beyond any doubt that they were an elite fighting force capable of executing the most complex missions. But in the cynical arithmetic of the military, success simply means more work. The generals, now aware of the potency of the Black Rangers, began to deploy them mercilessly, treating them as an elite, disposable hammer to smash through the most hardened enemy defenses. They were attached to the 7th Infantry Division, fighting deep in the mountainous heart of Korea. The war had settled into a brutal, grinding conflict over key pieces of terrain, jagged, nameless peaks that became monuments to senseless slaughter. The 2nd Rangers were rarely kept off the line. They were constantly on patrol, setting ambushes, probing enemy trenches, and seizing the high ground. They became specialists in what the Army called contested terrain operations, fighting where the enemy was most determined to hold and the casualties were highest. The conditions they faced were beyond harsh. The Korean winter gave way to a muddy, unforgiving spring. The frozen earth thawed into a thick, clinging sludge that sucked boots off the men's feet. They were perpetually cold, perpetually wet, and perpetually exhausted. The supply system, designed to support massive infantry units, often faltered when dealing with a small, independent ranger company operating miles from the main lines. They frequently went without hot food, fresh socks, or adequate ammunition, relying on their training and their internal bonds to survive. Their defining characteristic remained their mastery of night combat. The Chinese army, fearing American air superiority, ruled the night. They used the darkness to move men, launch assaults, and infiltrate positions. The 2nd Rangers became the counterforce. They owned the hours between dusk and dawn. They would go out on listening patrols, missions where a small squad of men would crawl into the space between the enemy's front lines and the friendly lines, lying motionless for hours, listening to the enemy's movements. This required a discipline and nerve that few other units possessed. They would return not just with intelligence, but with captured prisoners and vital enemy communications, earning them a fearsome reputation among the Chinese themselves. But while their performance on the battlefield was flawless, the institutional racism of the Army never completely relented. When they rotated off the line for a brief rest, the Black Rangers were still often subjected to the humiliating realities of segregation. They were segregated in the rear areas. They were often given the oldest, most dilapidated equipment. They were denied promotions and commendations that were routinely given to their white counterparts for similar acts of courage. This created a profound duality for the men. They were heroes to the Marines they supported and the GIs they fought alongside, yet they were still second-class citizens to the system they risked their lives to defend. This internal conflict forged a unique style of leadership within the Second Company. Their officers, men who had to fight twice as hard to get their bars, and their NCOs, veterans who had survived the humiliation of stateside training, became fiercely protective of their men. They ran their company as a closed, self-contained unit, relying on internal trust rather than external support. The Black NCOs became the emotional and tactical center of the unit. They didn't just enforce discipline, they enforced brotherhood. They made it clear to every man that their loyalty was to the man on their left and the man on their right, not to the flag of the Army that doubted them. One of their most crucial battles came during the defense of a particularly nasty stretch of terrain, known simply as Hill 581. This hill was a key observation post, and both the UN and Chinese forces poured mountains of blood into its frozen earth. The 2nd Rangers were tasked with clearing the Chinese from a heavily fortified ridgeline that had resisted 2 previous attempts by white infantry units. The mission was classic Ranger work. A frontal assault was impossible. They had to infiltrate the position at night, scale the slope, and destroy the enemy from within. The assault on Hill 581 was a nightmare of close-quarters combat. The Rangers moved under the cover of a thick, cold fog, climbing hand over hand up the near-vertical rock face. They were laden with gear, climbing through the bodies of the men who had died trying to take the hill before them. When they reached the top, they found themselves in the middle of a dug-in Chinese company. The fighting devolved into a chaotic swirl of bayonets, grenades, and fists. It was a vicious, no-quarter battle fought in the mud and the dark. The Chinese defenders, who had been ordered to hold the position at all costs, were shocked by the ferocity of the attack. They were not expecting the discipline or the rage of the Black Rangers. The Rangers fought with a controlled violence, driven by the knowledge that failure meant not just death, but the vindication of every racist lie. They cleared the ridge, bunker by bunker, until the only sound was the heavy breathing of the survivors and the cries of the wounded. They had taken the hill in a single, devastating action. The capture of Hill 581 was a major tactical victory for the 7th Division, proving once again that the 2nd Ranger Company was an elite fighting force without equal. But the very success that should have earned them respect only served to seal their fate. The Army leadership was presented with a dilemma. How could they reconcile the incredible battlefield superiority of the 2nd Ranger Company with the political and social narrative of the segregated South?